Let me just give you a little bit background information to help clarify what the pre-war situation was. First, the power and authority of the federal government was weak and had been declining since Washington administration, as I noted. From a libertarian standpoint, when you find this, I thought this was good because it placed more power in the hands of people closer to home at the state and the local levels. Another historian by the name of Hummel states, quote, insofar as the war was fought to preserve the Union, it was an explicit rejection of the American Revolution. Both the radical abolitionists in the South fired as boldly championing different applications of the revolutionary purist principles, whereas the abolitionists were carrying on the assault on human bondage, the fire-eating secessionists embodied the tradition of self-determination, decentralized government, unquote. As a legal recourse, the legitimacy of secession was admittedly debatable. The Northern Republicans put empire above liberty and resorted to political oppression and war rather than suffer any abatement of national power. Of course, the protective powers, while favoring the development of Northern industry, raised production and purchasing costs for the South. And I mentioned later on that only about 1/4 of Southern families were slaveholders. Well, what does that tell you? That generally the people in the South who fought for the South were not fighting for slavery per se. They had to be fighting for the South, but doctors, they were not slaveholders. Protective tariffs, the burdens fell primarily on the South, while the North was benefiting from them. Radicals within the Republican Party would later be responsible for the disastrous repressions of the Reconstruction era, which was a huge disaster and a subject in itself. They were likely less pro-black than they were out for both political and economic control in the South, where they had heretofore emphasized little influence. It's interesting, this left-leaning historian Howard Zinn, who taught at my alma mater, Boston University, he's quoted as saying, it was not the moral enormity of slavery, but the anti-tariff, anti-bank, anti-capitalistic aspects of slavery which aroused the united opposition of the only group in the country with the power to make war. Who was this group? The national political leaders and the controllers of the national economy. The Republican platform of 1860, while noting some anti-slavery grievances, was more concerned about protective tariffs, homesteading, federally funding, improvement of rivers and harbors, which is mainly in the central, the Northwest, and in the Great Lakes area, and also the Pacific Railroad and National Bank. So the Republicans, in their platform, were not strongly promoting anti-slavery movements. The North was hardly of one mind, of course. You had New York interests that were heavily invested with Southern cotton, as were New England cotton manufacturers. They were highly dependent on the Southern cotton. When the secessionists broke away, it really scared people because the tariff rate in the northern states was then 47%, while the South put in a tariff rate of only 12%. What did this mean? That this would mean that the South would draw European trade interests and shift from the North. That really scared me. Slavery was dying around the world in developing nations, and the majority of slaves did not own slaves, as I mentioned. So two questions need to be asked. Why did the Southern states want to leave the Union, and why did the Northern states refuse to let them go? And I pretty much answered those questions in the 5 reasons. The North, in essence, had to be determined to hold the Union together with violence. Abolitionists in their campaigning began in the U.S. in 1830, and some abolitionists actually wanted to see the separation of free and slave-holding states. In other words, they wanted to see a breakup of the United States. They were so strongly against slavery. But what happened, and Steve's going to talk a little bit about more about this, was a compromise for preventing slavery's extension in the new territories. So, while the abolitionists opted for anti-slavery versus the Union, Republicans put the Union ahead of slavery. Even though Congress controlled the District of Columbia, they did not abolish slavery in that district when they had the opportunity to do so. So what does that tell you? Lincoln had received only 40% of the popular vote, but he won the electoral vote of every free state except New Jersey. It was the radical Republicans that gained control, however, and subsequently put the screws on the South versus federal patronage. Almost every federal employee, postmaster, whatever, it could be in customs officials, those people were controlled by the radical Republicans, and they were put, Northerners put that in place. So that's another reason the Southerners were unhappy. And the reason is they didn't have the political power in the South. Even though the Constitution of 1789 gave proportionally larger representation in the House of Representatives by counting the slaves as a fraction of the population until they didn't vote, it still wasn't enough to offset what the North had in the name of numbers. When they seceded, they promised the North that they would have free navigation from the reaches of the Mississippi from south to north. That was one of the concerns, especially the western territories, west of the Appalachians. But that didn't satisfy the North. The South, of course, was a little concerned too by events such as Harper's Ferry in October 1859. That scared them. But the South also had qualms about secession too. The man who became vice president of the Federal States of America, his name was Alexander Stephens, he originally opposed the secession because he believed what was in the Constitution and the laws that existed, for fugitive slaves were stronger, and they would be effective or could be effective. He was afraid once the South seceded, they'd have this huge migration and runaway slaves run to the north. And so that was one of his initial concerns. And in closing, I'll just talk a little bit about Texas. The governor of Texas, Sam Houston, he was opposed to secession, but the secession ordinance was passed on February 1st, 1861, after the secessionist convention overwhelmingly approved it. It was then ratified by almost a 4-to-1 popular vote on February 23rd, 1861, and Texas joined the United States of America on March 2nd, 1861. I went online and I reproduced a document. It's called Texas Secedes from the Union, and it gives the ordinance and whatever. And one of the whereases, it says, the federal government has failed to accomplish the purposes of the compacted union between these states in giving protection either to the persons of our people upon an exposed frontier or to the properties of our citizens. And what that meant, in effect, was the federal government was not doing a good job in controlling the Indians, especially the Comanches that were on the western frontier of Texas. They were continually going into settlements and small villages and ranches, whatever, and destroying them, killing people, stealing the horses and everything else. And so the Texans saw a problem with that. Secondly, there were banditti that were coming up from Mexico. They were also stealing cattle and doing similar things with the government. And the government in Washington was not doing a good job, as many claim they're not doing today. Not anymore. So it's an interesting reflection. And the second whereas says this: the recent developments in federal affairs makes it evident that the power of the federal government is sought to make a weapon with which to strike down the interests and property of the people of Texas and her sister slave-holding states, instead of permitting it to be, as was intended, our shield against outrage and aggression. And the second document that was online is the Texas Declaration of Secession, and this is it's a little bit more stronger because it uses a lot of strong language and including some stuff that people would take umbrage with. And one of the sentences I'll read is: she was received as a commonwealth holding, maintaining, and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that has existed from the first settlement of the wilderness by the white race, in which her people intended should exist in all future time. That's pretty strong language, but obviously the slaveholders in Texas wanted that stated, and it's not a good reflection, of course, in this case. Well, I could go on and on and on, but it's obviously that the majority of the people in Texas were pro-secession, and that's how it came about. Now I'll let Steve go into a little bit more detail about what transpired to bring about the war.